Thank you for joining us here at the Smart Park Hub for another Café Scientifique. Thank you for being here in the room, much appreciated. And to the viewers online, thank you for joining us virtually. My name is Annemieke Vernorst, and I'm the Associate Vice President Research. Let me start to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, and that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people's homeland, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The university respects the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledges the harms and mistakes of colonialism, past and present. We are moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So Café Scientifique is a program that brings together experts with non-experts for discussions about the questions that their research is raising. These cafes are open to everyone and take place during the academic year on a Wednesday. We typically highlight interdisciplinary research that is making an impact here at home in Manitoba and indeed around the world. And it is my great pleasure that today's discussion will focus on some of the challenges of supporting teens with higher body weight. Chairing today's panel is Dr. Leslie Roos from the Department of Psychology in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Roos' research focuses on investigating the factors of early life stress that can put children at risk of mental health and achievement inequities. It is now my great pleasure to pass things over to you, Leslie. I wish everyone a joyful night, enjoy the discussion, and we'll see you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for our audience members here and online. It's really a pleasure to be here. I had the opportunity to do a previous cafe all online, and it's great to be here in person today. I really feel, honored to be talking with the experts on our panel. Dr. John McGavick, registered dietitian May Santos, and joining us online, Dr. Emily Cameron, to speak about this topic of supporting mental and physical health for higher body weight youth. This is an area that's really important to me as a co-researcher and someone who really admires the expertise of the panel here today and all the work that they're doing, as well as from the perspective as someone who managed challenges with binge eating and mental health distress as a youth, really brings sort of a personal element to the importance of advocating research in this area from a destigmatizing lens. We're going to get started this evening by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and talk to us a little bit about their experiences and their stories that have brought them to this topic of research. John.
Hello, welcome, and thank you very much for acknowledging the traditional lands. I'm born and raised here on Treaty 1 territory. I'm a graduate of kinesiology just over there as an undergrad here at the University of Manitoba. And what brought me to this space specifically was my passion for exercise and physical activity that was fostered here at the University of Manitoba in the Faculty of Kinesiology, but then also working in the pediatric endocrinology clinic and working with a number of Indigenous youth who were living with type 2 diabetes or at risk for type 2 diabetes, and recognizing that my expertise, quote unquote, and my passion for physical activity was not at all resonating with their needs. And so hopefully what we're going to talk about today is that trajectory of trying to break away from the biases that I had about what leads to differences in weight status or pediatric diabetes, and what we're mandated to do, which is to work alongside patients and communities to develop better strategies for them, to empower them and support them as they try to overcome chronic conditions associated with overweight.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and I'm really honored to sit here with esteemed mentors and colleagues now. So I'm May. I'm a registered dietitian, and I had just graduated with my master's in human nutritional sciences at the University of Manitoba. This is my home campus, but I was also a CRIM trainee not too long ago. So I think my personal interest in this study specifically and in this topic is really stemming from personal experience. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I had moved to Canada when I was 11, and I was living in a much bigger body. And I think growing up with that experience really changes the lens in which I practice, and that's coming from a very non-diet approach, and I think really trying to get to know the clients or the people that I'm working with is my main practice. And so, when this opportunity to work with Dr. McGavock and Dr. Roos and Dr. Cameron came up, I was really interested, and I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think there's definitely a gap in the research that we know today that we'll talk about later.
Thank you. Emily.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as well. I am thrilled to be joining you. I am in British Columbia, so I'm joining virtually. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work primarily with children, youth, and families, and I have a particular love for working with adolescents. I came to this space as well from kind of a few different intersections. I certainly resonate with a lot of the weight-based stigma and body image and diet culture that that youth grow up in and are affected by. As a clinical psychologist or as a trainee, I worked in several different intersections between mental health and health contexts, and really saw firsthand how important it was to address a lot of different types of health concerns or considerations from a multidisciplinary framework and include that mental health lens. So I also was thrilled to be part of some of this work to bring that mental health perspective, but also to be back involved on a multidisciplinary team.
Wonderful. Thank you for all those introductions. I'm going to get started with a discussion today by asking our panelists to comment on, what you see as, a pressing issue, a pressing question in the field, and sort of how that's informed by population trends over time and progress, along with perhaps limitations of our research. Go ahead.
First?
Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, I think I'd like to acknowledge and share with you that probably the most persistent and the strongest risk factor for children living with overweight or children at risk for diabetes or children living with type 2 diabetes is poverty. And our society is living with growing higher rates of poverty, higher rates of inequities. And these high rates of poverty and inequities are really a moral failing of our whole Western culture. And I think that's where we really need to start addressing obesity. If we open the paper, if we read something online, it's usually about diet and exercise. And so what really brought me to this space was I had a scientifically driven question around a certain type of exercise that I thought was great, that was being promoted, a decade ago as the cure for X, Y, or Z. And then in the first few weeks of running this study and bringing teenagers into our lab or bringing teenagers to the YMCA or taking them out on field trips to do different activities and getting to know them, it was very clear immediately that the stressors in their life were overwhelming, and they were far more important to them to overcome than whatever exercise program that I was trying to deliver. And so right away I realized I had not at all connected with what the needs of these families were when I started to think about running a research study or designing a research trial. And so I think the biggest failing that we have in science in this space is that we haven't connected at all with the needs of youth. If we take a look at trends over time, we see the changing colors of the maps where the proportion of overweight and obesity is growing year after year and decade after decade. But one of the graphs we never see is that these rising rates are disproportionately driven by youth living in poverty, and that higher income youth, or youth living in households with higher income, they've actually seen a flattening or a decreasing in their rates of overweight or obesity. And so our society is doing a good job, if you will, by benefiting the privileged, and we've had a moral failing in our inability to work with families and then design patient and family specific programs that support the needs of youth. And so I think what we need to do moving forward is understanding how complex these factors are, how they're driven by some structural things in society, and how we need to meet intimately with families to talk about what we can do to best support them and to best support teenagers.
Absolutely, really appreciate that perspective and highlighting those structural pieces of what is too often, termed an individual level challenge to overcome. May, I wonder if you could speak to some of these, thoughts that you might have or perspectives about the state of the field in your area of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So in nutrition research, we're really lacking, for lack of a better term. Generally, there's not much research on kids, on youth, and specifically not about any kind of weight management strategies or interventions. There's actually a recent paper that got published. It's a systematic review on youth perspectives and their parents' perspectives on weight management strategies, and they were mostly about bariatric surgery, which is not necessarily a first-hand approach, or it's not something, it's not a tool for everybody to have. And so I think having all the factors that John just talked about, it's really important to kind of understand the context of what youth might be living in and understand the many different influences and factors that could influence our strategies and interventions.
Thank you. Emily, I'm wondering if you could speak to some of your experiences on the mental health intervention frame and to this question.
Yeah, I think, as John had said as well, higher body weight, or traditionally under the medical term of obesity, was traditionally seen as related to poor health choices, more on like an individual level, as opposed to acknowledging more of this systems framework. And so a lot of the work that I do and how I think about things, and also how some of the literature is going in this area, and the evolution of some of the research, is to move outwards and look at the other things at play to inform intervention. So as John was talking about, considering poverty and some of the other factors that all interrelate to put people at greater risk for health outcomes. And so these are things not just about poverty or higher body weight, but from the mental health perspective, there's a greater understanding of the relationship between emotion regulation and mental health and emotional functioning, behavioral functioning, with our health behaviors. So, if you're feeling really low, it's really hard to feel like you want to get up and go for a run. Or if you're feeling really anxious, it might be really hard to get out and do these social activities that are better for your well-being and ultimately better for your health. And those might be related to then eating behaviors, or put you at greater risk for adverse social experiences or bullying. And then kind of wrapped into all of that too can be other types of discrimination when a youth is living in a heavier body as well. So weight-based discrimination or weight-based stigma. So what we're trying to do, and some of the acknowledgement in the literature in other areas of health, and also in type 2 diabetes, which is a little more what we as a team are doing, is acknowledging these intersections of all the components that really influence a youth's well-being and their ability to engage with the interventions as well. Things like bringing parents into the conversation, and also trying to reduce some of that shame or stigma that's related to their current health status by acknowledging that this isn't about one individual, that this is about a family system, the larger neighborhood system, and larger kind of, even from there, the government in which we live in that has kind of perpetuated some of these other factors like poverty.
Thank you. Absolutely. All those, intersections are certainly important and critical to consider when we think about the components of how youth achieve wellness and how parents support wellness for their family. John and May, I'm curious about your reflections on this role of mental health in supporting, overall wellness and quality of life for youth.
Yeah, and I think that's the perfect transition from sort of these structural factors and how they influence a child's overall well-being, and how that's maybe a mediator between their structural exposures and how it relates to their weight status, their quality of life. So one of the studies that we had done was with a large cohort of youth who were living with overweight, and they were living with type 2 diabetes. We had asked them to fill out some questionnaires, some of them about factors that support their resilience, and some of them, some questionnaires about stress and distress in their life. And then we wanted to know, how ready are you to make the behavior changes that you're being asked to make in a clinical setting? So when you go in to see your pediatrician or to see your endocrinologist, they're asking you, number one, could you increase your physical activity a little bit every day? Could you reduce the amount of fat that you have in your diet? Could you get away from screen time a little bit? So we asked them, how do you feel? How ready are you to make these steps? And the first overwhelming signal that we saw in the data was that the more distress and the more stress that a child had in their life, and the more mental health concerns they had, obviously, the less ready they were. So these messages are coming across to the kids, and they're being blocked by this overwhelming, immediate, pressing need, which is, I need mental health support. I'm stressed, I'm distressed. I need someone to help me get through that first, and then maybe I can get through. The disconnect is we might think they're not doing it because they're not educated. And by giving them more education, we're just perpetuating the bias that it's your fault, you should do more, but we're also neglecting their immediate need, which is their mental health. On the flip side of that, the adolescents who had a sense of mastery and a better mental health and had responded that they do have supports in their life, they were much more ready to engage in and adopt those behaviors, like getting away from the screen time, choosing physical activity, being able to, if they can, modify their diet a little bit. And so for us, that resonated a lot to say, well, maybe the starting point for this is trying to figure out what is the best way to support the mental health of adolescents, and then we can get through to some of these other modifying risk factors. The other thing is bias, which I hope we get to later, but kids live with so much of a sense of shame because society and maybe healthcare providers, not the ones surrounding me today, perpetuate this myth that this is an individual choice that the kids are making. And so to improve their mental health, we need to be connecting with them at a certain level, move away from stigmatizing them about weight, and connect with them in a way that fosters positive mental health so that we can work together on solutions that are meaningful for them.
Thanks for sharing that, John. I think in practice, everything that you've said, I want to share this story that actually happened a few weeks ago during group. So this was myself and a few other research assistants were actually walking with the group, like the youth, and we had passed by one of the youth's pediatrician's office, and she just shares, how seeing that office actually triggered a lot of anxiety for her. And then she shares the story of how a lot of the times that she would go into a doctor's office, she would be told, exercise more, eat better, X, Y, and Z, which a lot of the other youth were kind of piping in and saying like, yeah, actually I've had a very similar experience. And I think that really resonated with me. And I think that's a really key experience to really hone in on, especially when we're, talking about these interventions, because a lot of youth, especially, folks who are living in poverty, it's not necessarily the education that they need. They know what to do. They've heard it so many different ways. And in fact, like as my in my practice as a dietitian, a lot of folks who are living in lower income households are, you know, more skilled in food preparation because they have to, and they have to figure out, you know, how to eat and manage with what they have. So I think it's really important to make sure that the youth are feeling validated and really understanding like where their mental health concerns are, because those are truly a priority, and you can't really get past, you know, in providing them with other interventions or just doing anything else if they're not feeling better.
I think those are both, you know, really, really critical perspectives, and really highlight some of the consequences of when healthcare generally is a mismatch for youth needs, and that the education and what we might say over and over again really becomes something that can further harm youth that we're trying to support. And, you know, I really, really appreciate the perspectives that have been highlighted from everyone about really listening to youth, really listening to patients, listening to families, and changing gears when the messages that we're trying to communicate aren't being well received. When we were doing some prep for this call, May, I think you and Emily as well highlighted this idea of meeting youth where they're at in terms of mental health and physical health, and, you know, dietary considerations. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that and what it means to meet a youth where they're at.
Sure. So I think another great example is I like to tell stories. I think they just give so much more information. So a few weeks ago for group, one of the topics that we were talking about was beg lunch, just because, you know, youth spend most of their days at school, and so that's, you know, a topic that I thought might be really interesting to talk about. And we were just chatting about, like, you know, oh, who brings lunches to school? I know in my high school experience, I did not all the time. And so I figured, okay, maybe that's something that would be of interest to them. And I gathered information that they actually, most of them don't bring lunches to school. And so then we started talking about, oh, what, you know, foods are available in your school environment, or what might be, you know, restaurants that's available. And to my surprise, they actually mentioned that a lot of them would skip the dishes, you know, restaurant food and whatnot. And I think that was a learning point for me as well, because I realized that there is such a huge and varied like food environment that these youth have to deal with. But not only that, but social situations that they have to navigate on a daily basis, right? So for example, one of the youth was kind of saying, well, you know, if I have a packed lunch, but all of my friends are doing you know, whatever, ordering wherever, then I'm probably going to do it too. And so we talked about how food is also a part of a social situation, and how, you know, food is not just for eating or nourishing, but also for kind of filling their cup that way. And I'm wondering if Emily has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I'm of a similar era as you, May. So we didn't have skip the dishes in high school, but certainly, you know, like hot lunches on Wednesdays, the kids who didn't get that, there was a level of bias towards or status about if you had a hot lunch versus if you were bringing your lunch. So there's, as John was talking about, the levels of kind of bias that kids live with. I think too, what you had spoken about already, May, as well, is this idea of, you know, going to a pediatrician office and being asked about your weight, and you know, the ways in which you're asked about that, or that's brought up across what I do professionally, regardless of kind of the target. A key factor is motivation and what we call motivational interviewing, and assessing that readiness that John talked about. So, and one thing that is really apparent in the groups that we're running now and the other groups that I've run, or the youth I've worked with, is what you think somebody might be ready for in terms of change might not actually be what they're ready for. And so that is also how I interpret that question, Leslie, in terms of meeting youth where they're at, is that when you're looking at something like physical and mental well-being, we don't have to just target weight loss. And in fact, planning for weight loss in and of itself isn't as helpful of a goal as looking at how much are you exercising, or what are you eating, or improving mental well-being, or improving things like sleep. And so there's different levels of stigma attached to each of those that might impact that motivation or readiness to talk about it, either in a group setting or individually. And one thing that I'm always happy to talk about, because I love talking about this level of behavior change, but sleep for teens is always hugely impacted for most, and it really goes to that kind of interaction of what it impacts. It's hard to, I'm sure we can all think about a time where we haven't had a good sleep and you're grumpier. It's harder to kind of get through that day. That cup is already got like a big rock in it. You just have way less patience as the day goes on. But it's also harder to eat well because you kind of just want comfort food, or it's harder to get up and exercise because you just want to kind of sleep or lounge or skip the dishes and sit on the couch, whatever that might be. So all of those things are really interwoven. And then when we don't engage in the kind of positive behavior that we're trying to change, then that can lead to that cycle of shame and making it less likely to do it again. So really just kind of highlighting that we can jump in from different starting points with youth or with anyone, and that acknowledging that flexibility with somebody and meeting them where they are ready to dive in can be so helpful in optimizing that change and also getting some buy-in for changing some of the other pieces as well.
I just wanted to chime in as well, just following Emily. I think in practice, what we've been doing, especially for we call them the Sunday sessions. So for our Sunday sessions, it's really important for me personally to get to know the youth, and I've had such a privilege of actually getting to know every single one. And I think just speaking to what Emily's saying, just figuring out where they're at in the behavior change model. You know, some kids might be in the pre-contemplation stage, and it's just a matter of really being flexible with the types of stuff that we're doing that day. It's something as simple as, you know, something like, oh, we're planning to do dodgeball today, but some of the youth might be like, I am not in the mood for that. And it's like, okay, cool, we're gonna do something else. Might be like line tag or whatever, shooting baskets. And that's, I think, really getting that buy-in from the youth, but also just acknowledging that we hear you. That's okay. We don't have to do everything that's been set in stone today.
And I want to acknowledge that excellent responses, team. And the Obesity Canada, which is a network of healthcare providers and patient partners, they have the 5 A's that healthcare providers are recommended to adhere to. And I would extend that to parents. And as a parent, the first A is ask. And as a parent of a 6-year-old, I get all hung up on something, right? It could be like, who'd you play with today? Or like, did you play basketball? Because I know you love basketball. Like, were you shy? And now I'm hung up on it, right? But the first ask should be from a pediatrician, from a healthcare provider, from a parent. Like, maybe say, you know, I've been thinking about your weight or this weight-related behavior. Is it okay if we talk about it? Empowering the child. If they say no, step away, right? He doesn't want to talk about basketball. We're not going to talk about basketball. And then if yes, then assess. Well, what about this do you want to talk about? And then if you can, assist. Okay, well, here's some suggestions. At the end, too, there's also an agreement. Do we agree that this is maybe a goal that we can both work on? And then the 5th day, I think I already said assist, but which is how do we work together on making this happen and what can I do to help you out? And in that case, the way I see it is it's a shared decision between the two, and you're empowering the child at the beginning, your child, or the child if you're a healthcare provider, in opening up about something, a behavior or about their weight that they want to talk about or they feel empowered to talk about. And for any healthcare providers here, the first thing I would say is get rid of the scale and don't make that the first thing that a child does the first time they come into your clinic, because the moment you do that, you've gotten rid of everything else and you've told them the thing that's most important to me is what you just did.
Really, really critical perspectives, and I feel that the fire behind each of your points of discussion, that this is something that is so important. And although we might not know all of the answers at this point, that there are some things that are known that are important to change to really move towards better practices and hopefully best practices that can continue to improve over time. One thing that we talked about in this prep call is this idea of advocacy. So there's lots of different ways that we might advocate for changing our approach to working with higher weight youth, to doing research in this area, to informing clinical practice and supporting families. I'm wondering, if you could each speak to one thing that's really, really important to you from this advocacy approach, knowing that, we can act at so many different levels within the systems in which we live.
Maybe we could start with Emily.
Sure. I think this nicely segues in, because one thing I also wanted to add to John's comment is not just even parents, that is certainly a great level of defense, and they spend a lot of time with youth, but then the other individuals that spend kind of the most amount of time with youth being teachers. And there was a study done a few years ago that looked at um, some of the things that were most highly associated with positive body image in teens. And one of them was teachers seeing students as people, which I would kind of put in the category of teachers being compassionate to students. And that if teachers can also take that approach and be there to listen and ask those open-ended questions about how to support youth as well. Certainly they're going to be around or privy to a lot of the peer relationships that we talk a lot about in youth with higher body weight as well, some of the bullying or weight-based stigma or discrimination that can happen. In terms of the advocacy piece, I think as we've kind of started to talk about is just really on a broader level advocating that I'm going to steal John's term here, is that you can be healthy at every size, and that weight doesn't automatically equal unhealthy, and that we need to look at some of the factors involved and consider this from a larger scope. And I think one thing that we've really heard from the teens is that being asked about weight when you go to the doctor, it's so important in the way that you're asked. And that in some cases being asked about or being told that you need to lose weight really reinforces for these youth that they just don't want to go, and they start avoiding the healthcare system. And that is, not a great cycle to have down the way. And, at least when parents are still involved, there might be a little bit more enforcement about going. But we really want to promote that access to all of the healthcare and ability to take care of ourselves. And so all of us as practitioners and clinicians who work with children and youth have a responsibility to create a non-judgmental environment where we can ask those open-ended questions and ask about motivation or areas that we can support them with without feeding into that cycle of shame or embarrassment.
Thank you. Mayor John, advocacy.
Maybe I'll just chip in after Emily. She kind of took all the words out of my brain, but another piece that I just really wanted to kind of acknowledge too is, again, coming back to meeting the people where they're at. So for example, for the youth, earlier in the study, we had kind of set some SMART goals, and so that really gave me kind of like an insight on what's important to them. And what we've been doing is providing them with resources or information that they may or may not need or want at the moment, but it's there for them to have if that's something that's going to work for them or is appropriate for them to use. So some of this might be different ways that you can exercise at home for free, or different ways that you might be able to engage in physical activity without having to go to the gym, or easy recipes that they might be able to make if they don't have very much, food skills or kitchen skills. And so I think that's one of the advocacy pieces. But the other one is always that as a practitioner, you are, you have the knowledge to be able to provide the youth, but it's truly what they need, and it really depends on their goal and what's important to them.
I'm going to give a complex answer. So at the level of teachers, just building on what Emily said, I think the first thing to think about is something that resonates with everything that I do in my lab, which is the the 3 universal psychological needs of teens. And I'll put it in this framework called the circle of courage. So if you're watching this online, or if you're here right now, just Google circle of courage and take a look. A teen struggling with weight or diabetes or something that makes them different from their peers is alone and is often left alone and is not engaged with. And the first element here, if you're a teacher, make sure that teen feels like they belong. Make sure that that teen feels they have a sense of independence and mastery. And how can you foster that in your classroom, in your school? And the last one in that circle, which is not in the core 3 needs, is generosity. And there was this amazing study where they randomized teens to volunteering time in their school versus not. And kids who volunteered lost weight, reduced their blood pressure, reduced their risk for diabetes just by giving of themselves. So as a teacher, think way beyond diet and exercise and move into something more holistic. As a parent, I would advocate strongly to give your child space and time and make sure that they feel like they are connected and they feel a sense of belonging and relationality to you and your family so that they can come out one day and talk about whatever it is they want to talk about. It may be a huge priority for you and you may be stressing out about it, but the more time you give them and the more respect you give them, the better off they will be. And then for the rest of us in society, call out weight stigma when you see it. Do not accept it. Do not perpetuate it. Whether that's in the media, whether that's hearing it in public, whether that's hearing it at the kitchen table we always blame our uncles, but your uncle, biased uncle. Do not perpetuate it because it hurts. It hurts that child every time they hear it, every time they see it. And so for us as a society, we may have that bias in us, recognize it, put it on the table, get rid of it, and do not let it perpetuate and hurt children.
Really, really powerful answers from the panel, and I think that they really speak to that, collective responsibility to challenge stigma and challenge weight bias when we hear it. I think that includes, when youth are present, and it also includes when they aren't present. It, communicates something about what's acceptable and what type of environment and community we want to be a part of, and our building that includes safety for youth with very different experiences. We're almost at a time when we want to go to questions, so we'll encourage folks to be thinking about that. But I want to ask our panelists, around the table and online, to think about one point of possible hope for this area moving forwards. What do you feel hopeful about from your clinical work, from your practice, looking to the future in supporting youth wellness? Go ahead, May.
I'm gonna start. I truly think that youth, especially at a teenage years, they're so resilient and they're so smart, and more often than not, especially in the time that I've had working with youth in our group, is they almost already know what they want. Sometimes your role, like what John was saying with the 5 A's, is truly kind of assist them and kind of see, different directions and how they might achieve their goals. But it gives me a lot of hope and passion, I think, in continuing in the space, because I do know that we need to do better in order to support our youth. And these little changes can truly change their future and their overall well-being.
Thank you. John?
I think about we are going through an incredible time in history right now when we talk about racism, colonization, addressing oppression, and that's being led and weight bias. And those things are being led by the next generation. And so I see my generation being pushed against a wall and to try to dismantle our past teachings and our past behaviors to really change the way we practice. And youth are taking care of one another. And so I see a lot of hope moving forward as we empower youth, bring youth into the healthcare setting, bring them into research as co-researchers, as experts with lived experience to help guide us in the next direction, or in the future directions. So I really hope that we can just provide more of that. Like, more dollars to invest in youth, more opportunities for youth to participate in these kind of activities, more youth to determine what their healthcare looks like in the future. And so that movement to me is really inspiring and pushes me every day to do a better job.
Thank you. Emily, hope.
I echo a lot of what has already been said. I think I'll add as well that I think Manitoba in particular is doing a really wonderful job of leading some of the charge in some of this momentum of acknowledging the harms and trying to repair and listen a lot more. And a lot of the work that I'm involved in now is more patient oriented, where we're asking those questions. And as John said, we're bringing patient partners or youth partners into the research and asking what they liked and what they didn't like. And what we have really tried to do over the last almost 4 months of the work we're doing currently with our intervention is to create an environment that is open to that feedback, regardless of what it is. And we've had the whole gamut of responses, and some things are good, and some things really aren't good. And we adapt, and we just show that we're listening and we're ready to make a change and adapt on the fly and hear what they're asking for. I think, as May said, people know what they need, youth know what they need. And if we're asking the questions and listening, I think that creates a collective hope that things will improve, both for patients or clients or youth, as well as on our side as clinicians and practitioners. And from more of my psychology side, I'm really hopeful at the direction that a lot of health-based programs are going, in that there's this acknowledgement of the importance of looking at kind of the whole system for youth, and not just physical well-being, but that it is so interwoven with emotional well-being as well, and that it's really important to address kind of an individual from lots of different areas of potential need, and not just focusing and kind of working in silos. We often in healthcare or in practice and in professions can work in silos, and that's really not often what somebody needs. They need that approach that we can all bring together when we are working together and communicating as well.
Thank you. I'm curious how the questions might work, and perhaps we can start from the audience here, if there's any questions that folks would like to put forward.
Thank you. Great presentation. Okay, it was echoing, my bad. I was wondering, how do you suggest or provide tips on how we can support young youth during, we have many wellness programs or skills programs. Usually we run them on campus like mini U programs. So when we have this one-off session, how would you like us, like NGOs or university, to support those young youths who might be in first year or they have siblings?
Absolutely. So the question was, how can the university, how can programs better support youth in thinking about aspects of physical activity or other engagement? It's a great question. Panelists. Go ahead. John.
Okay. Well, I think you said mini U, right? Or similar programs, like any program that's coming in with. So my first recommendation for all of these young programs is for the leaders to get familiar with the Circle of Courage. So I'm super biased in that regard, right? But just to step away from whatever the direct purpose of your program is, and to think about how can you support these other elements, because they always resonate really well with the kids. The second thing would be, at a certain point in your program, take a step back, engage the youth and say, we're on this trajectory together. What's working? What do you like? What don't you like? And then how can we meet your needs? And do it in a number of different ways, because you'll have very shy children. You'll have very outspoken children. So think about all the different ways that you can engage them into co-designing that together. And then lastly, a lot of times we focus on very specific, targeted things. You're going to learn math, you're going to learn science, you're going to be involved in hockey. And I think we need to take a step back and, like Emily said, see the child as a whole person. And as a whole person, they may need more than math that summer. And so what can you do in your program to support them? And have spots for the kids who almost never get spots. Make sure that you're not just perpetuating these inequities where the rich, affluent white kids get access, that you've got access for everyone, and that you're making space for the kids who probably need your program the most.
And I think just speaking with more programming, like I think you had mentioned Can You as well. So I think that's a nutrition-based program. I think just really taking a step back, like John said, and thinking about what types of nutrition education are we providing, what lens are we looking at with programming. And I'd really recommend taking a look at, non-weight bias approaches, even the way that you talk about food, like food neutrality, not diving into, good foods or bad foods because there's no moral value in food, and just really getting kids engaged in maybe food skills or learning where their food comes from, and doing that kind of programming. Yeah, I don't know if Emily has.
Yeah, this is a topic that May and I agree a lot on as well, is that idea of neutrality in language when you're talking about food, good or bad, or healthy and unhealthy, and that there's moderation in everything, and how you engage with food and your relationship with food is so important on having finding the gray zone, basically, not living in black and white of what's good and what's bad, and I can't eat this because it's bad, perpetuates that shame, because when you do eat it, you have a craving for a piece of cake and you have a piece of cake, it's going to perpetuate that shame. So just being very aware of the language and looking at that lens, as May talked about. And I would add, trying to kind of take that step back and look at the obstacles to what you're asking youth or children to be doing. So from that intersectionality lens of all the things that can get in the way. So having, kids needing to go for a walk in their neighborhood as part of the program assumes that they live in a safe neighborhood where they can do that, or that they can do it with a parent available at a certain time, or that that this is something that can always be achieved. So even though it's a free way of exercising, that there might be other factors that we haven't really considered when we're asking things that we think are simplistic of our youth or our families. And then, as John talked about as well, just being really flexible in the ways that we present information and ask children and families to absorb it. So in what ways are we perpetuating the kind of types of ways we ask people to learn, sit down, take it in, or to play certain sports, and really just get a sense of asking those questions. What do they want to do? How do they learn best? And then being able to adapt. So I think John had mentioned about this too, is if you ask a question, you also need to be able to hear the answer and address the answer. So creating that environment of feedback and collaboration in creating the program.
I would love to know what you would say as a as a local or national expert in child mental health. What kind of things do you think we need to add into child programs to support their mental health?
Unsurprisingly to panelists, I would encourage parents and teachers and caregivers to also do some reflection on their own mental health and their own relationship with food. I think parents are often, caregivers are often so concerned about their child and youth's well-being across dimensions, and they use the right language for the child around eat what you want, a little dessert's fine, all of these things that are really their best efforts to perhaps parent their children different than how they were parented. But if, as a parent or caregiver, you're saying that while also saying, oh, but, none for me, that, that doesn't work with my diet goals for this month, or even just choosing to never eat food that is perhaps in this idea of something that could be unhealthy or could be bad, that there's guilt and shame about for yourself. Kids are really smart. Youth notice what's going on. And when we talk about the pathways through which children and youth develop internalized shame and stigma, there are components and pathways and variants, statistically for the nerds in the room, myself included. There's variance explained by what parents say and do to their kids or with their kids. There's also variance explained about what kids see. So what kids see their parents doing and other people in their environment. So I think really thinking about that whole environment and having some of that reflection on your own relationship with body weight, with food, with body neutrality, food neutrality. Other questions?
Anything in the chat?
Yeah, you just spoke about what kids see, and one question I have, if I think about our society, let's say kids watch YouTube videos, there are commercials, McDonald's, I don't want to shame anyone, but generally speaking, you go to the cinema, you buy the smallest Coke, and then for 25 cents you can get a larger Coke, and for 50 cents you get a gigantic Coke. And I just wonder whether you have done research or are aware of research in that area that actually looks at those factors. So what's really the influence of overall society and the way we have changed as a society in the way we do things? We get busier. Perhaps we are more ready to pick up food rather than to cook at home. But also all the media that kids are continuously exposed to. Just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I can jump. So you want to go ahead? Okay, so on the media side, there is a ton of evidence to show that corporations know exactly how to get people to buy things. That's why they're successful. And so I think targeting children at an early age to have a preference for certain foods, high sugared foods, things like that. So there is definitely a media component to this, and I think having parents recognize that or having policies around that definitely has a part to play in this. But I'm going to bring it back to what the mental health side here. And has anyone heard of the marshmallow test? The marshmallow test. So the marshmallow test was a famous test done by a famous psychologist. We're going to think about his name. And so he brought in these preschool children into the lab, and he said to the children, here's one marshmallow. I have to go away and get some things to get us ready for the activity we're going to do today. I'm going to be back in 5 minutes. If you don't eat that marshmallow, I'll give you a second one, right? So it was a bit of a test for their ability to self-regulate or control their habit, let's say. And so the test was how well could that child resist the marshmallow. And the follow-up study showed that children who resisted the marshmallow tend to have better outcomes later in life, right? So there was, but the experiment was actually more intricate than that, and they don't talk about it. So one of the things was, well, what do the kids do to distract themselves from the marshmallow? And so the kids would do all kinds of different things. They'd smell the marshmallow, they'd take little bites of the marshmallow, they'd start singing and looking up at the sky, right? All kinds of things. And so the kids were getting really good at it, right? So they were like, okay, I know I can't eat this, so I'm not going to do it. But then the researchers got really crazy. So they would say, I'm going to tell you a story right now about Billy and his friend. And his friend said, I hate you. I don't want to be your friend anymore. And then they said to the kid, well, what would that feel like to you if your friend said that to you? And then they did the marshmallow test. So they created psychological stress in the child. What do you think happened to the resilience? Plummeted. They gave them math tests. They stressed out the kids. Now, I don't think we could get away with this kind of experimentation today, but the more that they mentally stressed the kids, the harder it was for them to do that. And so I think the more that we put on kids, the more they're going to be susceptible to that media and to those factors. So again, it comes back to creating some kind of resilience around the kids, parenting around resilience, parenting around reducing the mental stress so that they can do what, even at a young age, they know they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the importance of controlling what we can and teaching coping skills for how kids might navigate the aspects in the world that parents, caregivers, teachers can't control. It's a tricky line to walk, knowing that there's a lot of influences at play. May, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I kind of have like a 3-part response. So the first one is absolutely, John, you're correct. There's an entire field of like food psychology and food marketing, and they are getting really good at including psychology in marketing in order to target consumers' wants and desires and how to, play all these different hormones in the brain. So when kids see a specific food package, it's like, oh my God, it's like Christmas every day. So that's one thing. So what I could say to that is, again, honing back to the foundational reflections as an adult, as an educator, as a parent, and just really thinking about like what messages do I want to provide for my child, or what lessons do I want to share with them? How does my relationship with food influence theirs, and how does, and a lot of children and youth, they're not in charge of purchasing decisions. That's mostly the parent's role. And so a resource that I would like to share with everybody is the Division of Responsibility in Feeding by Ellen Satter. It's quite a beautiful framework in which that the parents are, they're decision makers on what to feed, when to feed, and the children are in charge of deciding how much they want to eat, if they want to eat. And I think that really provides a good framework in kind of, thinking about managing or working through situations where you might not have so much control. The second piece to this is, again, food neutrality. And even if you are, passing by, let's say, a movie theater, it's a fun little family outing. And then you can talk to your kid maybe about popcorn and different pops and why there's so many different types of foods. And then the other piece that I also wanted to mention was using mindfulness skills. And I think Emily can probably talk a lot more about this is a really common skill that we try to incorporate a lot when working with the youth that we're working with. Not only does that kind of play into intuitive eating, which is not necessarily, a must-do thing that we're doing with the kids right now, but the mindfulness aspect is really, really important, and that really brings them back to grounding their emotional regulation. And I'm going to pass it on over to Emily. I think she's going to speak about this a lot better than I am.
Sure. I also have several different thoughts. I'll try to consolidate them. John's comment about the marshmallow test, which was out of Stanford, and I think it's Walter Mischel, I think was his name. Yeah, and he, this idea of immediate gratification or delayed gratification, and I think in terms of this idea is a perfect connection to what we're doing, in that the stress and emotion regulation impacted the ability to meet what the goal was in that situation. And that's really what we're trying to do is provide those longer term coping skills for achieving delayed gratification, because health and health behaviors are a long-term, lifelong achievement that takes a lot of work, and there will inevitably be ups and downs and times where it's you're not as consistent with meeting your goals as other times, but the ability to regulate your emotions, to be mindful of where you're at and what your goals are and how to act with your goals, and the fact that you might be feeling more emotional in that moment, and the things that you can be doing so that there's that mindfulness connection to the emotions and the urge or impulse in that moment to avoid the exercise or to eat the food that isn't consistent with your goal in that moment. So all of this is a good kind of example of the importance of the combination of what we're talking about. But certainly to this point of advertising and that the advertisers know exactly what they're doing. I have an 18-month-old who doesn't care about playoff hockey being on until that A&W commercial pops on, and all of a sudden it's like eyes to the TV. And so I think absolutely that this is something that has just been mastered by advertisers from such a young age. And so there's certainly a level of that societal responsibility of values and priorities at that level, and that this isn't just something that we can target from one individual at a time, that this is, as John said, a moral failing of our society, and that, upsizing, can't remember the McDonald's term in this moment, but all of that of it being quite cheap to do that also feeds into some of the inequities, in that if it feels less expensive to go for a quick meal at McDonald's and upsize and have kind of those like calorie dense meals, and that be the outing, that perpetuates some of those inequities as well. So there's this much greater level and responsibility for really targeting the wellness of children in our community and in our society, that I hope this helps relieve some stress or stigma of individuals and also families, that this is much greater than them, and that we have only so much power to address certain things, but that, social media, there's so many components that have a responsibility to also make adjustments, and that this is really a social justice issue as well, that isn't just, to be put on individuals in our society.
Really well said responses all around, panelists, and really appreciate the question. Are there other questions from our audience here?
All right. I wonder, you started today talking about a lot of the intersections that can lead to these health issues, such as poverty. Do you have advice for parents who are struggling with those issues themselves, poverty or mental health, and maybe don't have time or energy, but are concerned for their children or concerned for themselves? How can they break this cycle?
A really important question. Yeah, for our panelists, that's my role as a moderator. I get to pass along the tough questions.
I am going to say that parents do amazing jobs of taking care of their children no matter what. And I think in this audience here, and maybe those online, we have a responsibility to help those parents. So I'm going to dodge your question. And I'm just going to say, it's our moral responsibility to look ourselves in the mirror and to look at our society and say, is it okay that kids at the end of every week or at the end of every 2 weeks don't have enough food in the house for 3 or 4 days until that paycheck's there? And I don't want to live in a society like that. So what am I willing to give up? Who am I willing to vote for? What kind of things can I do to look at my society and say, my society is only good as the people who are struggling the most. And if they're struggling in a deep, deep way, it's my responsibility to figure out, how can I make sure, like, how can a kid not eat in Canada today when we just have so much in front of us, right? And so it's our responsibility to look at those parents and say, what can I do to help you? So that, I don't have science behind that, although I do know that the more resources that parents have, the better off their kids are, and the better their mental health is, and the better off they do. And so the more we can push for a more equitable society, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I echo all of those things and say it really is a societal issue to consider these intersections of food insecurity, racism, systemic inequities about who has access to what and when, and who experiences, what adversities, and who's likely to experience, different types of trauma that we know can really impact our physical health and mental health. One other piece that I think is important to recognize is that, mental health challenges and, different body weights also do affect families, across the economic spectrum. And so I think there are, visible stressors that a family might experience. Then there's also a lot of invisible stressors that parents and children and youth can carry. And so I think if you do find yourself in a situation where you're concerned for a child's well-being or youth's well-being, or you recognize that your own mental health isn't where it should be, is having some compassion as much as is possible. As John mentioned, that you're recognizing those struggles is such a deeply self-reflective step, and that I have no question that people who are in that position are doing absolutely the best that they can with the resources and capacities that they have to be meeting the needs of their family. Parents, really want nothing more than to support their kids to thrive and live the life they want to live. And one of the reasons I find it so inspiring to work with families, but also the importance of communicating to parents to think about reaching out to local community resource centers, are often a hub where there's going to be people who know what resources might be in your community, and start to have those conversations and sharing the types of things that you might be struggling with can be a really, really critical first step in reducing some of that stress, reducing some of that sense of isolation, whatever the stressor or the challenge is, and knowing what your next steps could be. But without sharing that you are struggling, it's really not possible often to know what the next steps could be moving forward. May.
I think those are very excellent points. And I think another point that I wanted to give, especially to parents or to families, I'm personally not a parent, so I truly don't understand the struggles of having to care for yourself and having to care for your child. But I have worked with a lot of families and a lot of parents, and in a current role that I'm in, I echo what Leslie said. I think the first step is to take a deep breath, giving yourself grace, and giving yourself the acknowledgement that you are doing the best that you can. I think that's like the absolute first step. And then reaching out to somebody or anybody, because there's truly quite a lot of community efforts being done in and around, Winnipeg and Manitoba, although there really isn't enough. But, if, for example, you're concerned about your child, even speaking to the school that they're going to, or like a teacher, because they might have connections that you might not know about, or you can't just Google. Or even reaching out to your public health healthcare practitioners and just simply asking, what's available around me, and just kind of taking it one step at a time.
And I'll add,
Emily.
I'll add as well. One of the types of therapy that Leslie and I do a lot of work in, and what we're kind of all doing together here in some of our work with youth is called dialectical behavior therapy, and it takes this idea of acceptance and change, so that it's not just that everything needs to change or that we can change everything, that there are things that can't be changed in that moment, and that still means that there are things that we can do. So as Leslie kind of talked about, that everyone is doing the best they can, and even just that kind of like mantra to yourself or acknowledgement in that moment where it is so hard to manage, or that you're feeling a lot of really big, strong, or heavy emotions because of the stressors that are going on, that giving yourself grace in that moment, or forgiveness or compassion, and that can often be really helpful in then getting through it with a little bit more ease, or at least being able to kind of get through it maybe a little bit quicker, but still really acknowledging and validating that those are really difficult moments. And then I think, as others said as well, this idea of change. So maybe it's reaching out to a friend, maybe it's working together with your youth to create a plan, or navigating kind of the resources that you can. But I think also with what we've talked a lot about today is that change on our much greater level outside of families. So, and that's where that other kind of acceptance piece comes in for families, is that there's things out of their control in that moment. I hope a lot of, as I had mentioned, that these intersections of everything going on, I would hope provide a level of removal of some of that stress or blame or responsibility, that this is much larger than one individual or one family or one parent, and that they are doing the best that they can, and at a societal level that there are a lot more things going on that takes more than just them and their family to fix, so that it really is trying to, use what you can as best as you can, and then reach out to other resources as possible. And then, as John mentioned, that we all have a responsibility as well to help make that change and support the families in our community.
I have a quick question too. So great talk. This has been super interesting. So my impression is that your main research subject has been teens. You talked a lot about how there are particular stigmas and biases that affect teens. Would you expect your findings to be similar or different for, say, younger children or even for adults? Are there any differences that you've noticed kind of between age groups?
Definitely. I think the role of parents shifts, and I think studies in younger youth are younger children are a little bit easier because parents have more involvement. And I think when we take a look at, and I'm not the expert here, so I'll defer to Leslie and Emily on this, but the mental health challenges tend to really ramp up in the teenage years, especially with girls. And so I think the strategies we would employ would be very different. And that just goes back to our need, I think, for person-centered. And so for younger children, it may be more of a parent-centered approach combined with a child-centered approach, whereas for an adolescent who's developing their independence and is moving into a sense of who they're going to be as an adult, it would be a much different person-centered approach. So that would be my response.
Yeah, I can speak to that as well. I do a lot of work pre-pregnancy and early childhood, and so I certainly am an advocate that we can set a lot of foundational parenting and family kind of values and skills early on. In terms of what we're looking at with teens right now, there is the research kind of speaks to a shift during puberty in terms of the appearance norms that teens subscribe to, and that's not quite as present earlier on, below the age of 10 or 8. So in younger children, we wouldn't expect them to hold quite as strong values or evaluations with their peers and appearance in the way that we've kind of talked about some of the weight-based stigma or appearance-based discrimination. That's not to say that can't happen earlier, but that we just see that really ramp up for teens. And in terms of how we know cognitive development, how our kids start thinking and perceiving and really being able to kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand the world around you, that also continues to develop until you reach that, well, for a long time, but that, the teen years are really that key time of feeling like you're always being evaluated. There's something known as the invisible audience with teenagers, that they think that everyone is always thinking about them and evaluating them, and that in reality, all teens are doing that. And so most teens aren't thinking about anyone other than themselves. But that it's a really, really hard time for this peer evaluation and these peer relationships and body image as well. So that is, I think, why there's kind of this key area in the teenage years, but really that the foundations of how parents talk about weight and body appearance and food and relationships with food and exercise and all of these other behaviors that we've been talking about, that those foundations and creating that resiliency within kids of creating strong social skills and emotion regulation early on helps really buffer against a lot of those social challenges that can come up in the teenage years too. And that would feed into adulthood. So then in terms of thinking about adults, again, that we can very much kind of teach a lot of these skills and things, but it's much more reactive at that time as opposed to earlier prevention or kind of building these building blocks early on.
One thing that I can add, in relation to the younger child and early childhood years is I think sometimes there can be this, societal narrative that our job is to protect children and youth from things that are hard. And that certainly we hope to protect our kids from many things that are challenging. Actually helping children cope with the stressors that they experience is a core element for building their resilience to cope with stressors later on in a healthy way. So cultivating a home environment where you might be able to share some emotional vulnerability, talk about challenges that you have in an age-appropriate way with your kids, and invite them to share experiences that they might be having that are challenging with peers, or with meeting expectations at school or in sports or in other relationships I might have is really, really critical for navigating physical health challenges or challenges related to self-regulation and things that they can and can't control, whether that's sleep or eating or exercise. There's so many different things that go into someone's identity and wellness. So I think not seeing all stressors as a negative thing, but as something that can be a learning experience to share in an age-appropriate way with your children, stressors that you might experience and how you navigate tough things that happen, disappointing things that happen, times when you felt lonely or distressed. And then helping your kids navigate those for themselves can help create an environment that when they are youth and experiencing those things in probably really, really acute, often distressing ways, that they might see the value in talking about those things and in seeking social support, which we know is one of the really most critical things for promoting wellness at any age. May?
I have nothing more to add to that, but I can say and hypothesize that if we were to do this with adults, we would do an entirely different study. Adult learners have much more different motivations than children, much less younger children, and they also face many different factors in their current life stage, whatever that might be.
I can read one more question, but does anyone have any questions here in the room before I proceed? No? We can take things maybe to a larger scale for our last question. When we're thinking statistically about obesity and health issues related to that, how does Manitoba compare to other provinces in Canada?
It's going to be a John question.
Yeah, so in terms of the rates of overweight and obesity, and we could have a long discussion about what that means. And I think I'll add some things in there. So if we just take a look simply at body mass index, Manitoba is one of the provinces that's not doing well. So we have a higher proportion of teens especially that are living with overweight or obesity. Children of color, so children, new immigrants, children who are Black, Indigenous children are disproportionately affected or living with obesity, and children from lower income neighborhoods as well, or households. So statistically, Manitoba is a place where we have a lot of work to do, and this is a good place for us to do this work. However, thinking about being healthy at every size and thinking about the Obesity Canada and how we look at this, there are other factors that come into this, and we don't really have a good sense of what are the comorbid let's say, the combination of living with overweight and having mental or emotional health distress? Or what is the combination of having living with overweight and having other stressors in your life? And so we don't have a good sense of the epidemiology there. But Manitoba is a place where we need to invest in holistic child health so that we can shift these numbers, especially for the kids who are structurally oppressed and structurally marginalized in society.
Anything to add, May or Emily?
I think too, demographically, as John said, I think Manitoba children are a lot more, or they face a lot of maybe barriers or systematic oppressions. Like you said, there's a lot of children who are of color who might be living in lower income families, and they're immigrants, and they might have, a long laundry list of family history that now their, doctor or healthcare provider is kind of talking to their families about, and that's a lot of hurdles to kind of get through to even, swallow, or no pun intended, but just to kind of manage and navigate, specifically for families who are living in lower income households and or maybe parents are working 2 or 3 jobs just to kind of make do. So definitely, I think Manitoba is a really great place to be doing these kinds of studies, and also getting to know what our community needs.
Thank you. Emily, anything to add?
Not entirely. This is definitely more John's area, but I echo what has been said. I think in terms of me reiterating what we've talked about, in considering the multiple different factors, but one thing that I've been struck with is how, as a result, Manitoba has some really great studies and key research happening in this area to address these concerns, and plans to move this out of Manitoba and address it kind of more broadly in Canada as well. John's leading the charge with some of that. So it's I think there's been a reasonable response to trying to improve the well-being of children in Manitoba, knowing some of these numbers, and then also expand what works to other children in Canada.
Stay tuned. We have one more question from the audience.
First, congratulations for the brilliant discussion. And what is your opinion about the commercial of Ozempic semaglutide and theaters and children's films? This had my attention because it seems like an easy alternative for this public that suffers today for these metabolic disorders. And as if to say, you can eat wherever you want, be sedentary, that later they will prescribe you and will solve. What your opinion about it?
I'll just try to summarize. So the question is around this very hot topic medication called Ozempic or semaglutide. And it's gaining a lot of popularity, and the clinical trials have shown significant weight loss. And it's kind of a low stress medication, but it's an injectable medication. And from a purely weight loss standpoint, it is a very effective medication. The downside is when you're off the medication, everything goes back up. So it's sort of an appetite suppressant, but for the drug companies, it's gold, right? Because so many people are living with overweight or obesity. This medication is something you have to take for the rest of your life. We don't know about the long-term effects, and I think we only have one randomized controlled trial in children right now, but it shows the same, that children lose weight. If we do not look at children as whole beings, and we only focus on their BMI, then that's a successful medication. But if we don't take a look at does the medication improve the whole quality of life of the children, then I'm not sure that this is our solution. For children who have severe physical complications related to obesity, things like bariatric surgery and maybe Ozempic do have a place, right? There are children who are progressing rapidly to kidney disease. There are children who have heart attacks in their, progress onto heart attacks in their 30s. And we do need for a segment of the population some significant medical intervention like that to protect them, in my opinion. However, I'm not sure we're ready yet to say, let's start using Ozempic in every child across the country.
My question's about the marketing.
Oh, marketing
in the
Ozempic.
Movie, in the Super Mario movie before the film.
They had Ozempic.
Yeah, I am a endocrinologist. And I was totally surprised with this marketing in the movie for children, for teenagers.
Right.
I never had seen something like this.
Well, I agree, and so there's a big push. So I'll go to the food. I don't really know a lot about marketing this medication to kids. I know that the marketing for this medication is crazy, because I'll be watching a hockey game and the commercial is, I just asked my doctor. I just asked my doctor. I just asked my doctor. And everyone around me is like, what are they talking about? And then Ozempic comes up. And so they're really pushing every person to go to their doctor and say, what is this? I need to be on it. Now, if they're doing that to kids, we need to regulate that in some way.
My 8 years old, my son, screaming at the movie, Mommy, Ozempic.
Yeah, right. Right. And I think there needs to be regulation there. Like, we can't be having these kind of ads affecting, the way a child or a young person goes to their physician to ask about something and to pressure for use that may not be approved yet,
Yeah,
And so,
it's a issue that will be had a discussion about this marketing with to the kids and teenagers about this medication.
And Quebec has taken a stance on advertising just certain foods to kids and the way that you advertise food. So you can't link Super Mario to a certain cereal or whatever. So Quebec has taken a stance. And so I think that would translate to this as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that interesting question towards the end. We are out of time, and I would like to thank John, Emily, and May. Thank you so much for being the panelist. And of course, also thank you, Leslie, for being the moderator. It was a very nice discussion. I learned something new. Thank you very much, and I say goodbye to everyone here in the room and virtually as well, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.